All right. Good morning. So we need to finish up talking about marketing strategy today and then move into environmental scanning. And then on Thursday, we will begin talking about my favorite topic this semester, which is marketing ethics. That's because that's the subject on which I wrote my dissertation, which is on ethics and marketing education and pedagogy. And it's the part that I really get enthused about and the part that students really hate because it's really hard and abstract. And I start getting really excited and you all look at me like, what planet did you just beam down from? Because like I said, it's hard and you have more questions and you have answers at the end of that. But you'll suffer through it and it will be all great. And we'll do a critical thinking challenge on Thursday to go along with that. So just as a recap from what we started on with Boston Consulting Group last time in strategy, we talked about this. It's a 2x2 matrix that basically you look at to determine where your products are and what you need to do in terms of managing those products. Most products start out as a question mark, and I put choose wisely here, and they move through the matrix. So we were using Apple as the example, and I said, what's a question mark for Apple? What kinds of new products are they releasing? And one of the things that I think is a big question mark for them is the storage. How many of you have an iPhone? And how many of you have the iPhone sends you a message that says, you're out of storage, you can upgrade your storage. They give you a certain amount of storage for free, and they want you to back everything up. Now, if you do this, you can run out of storage pretty quickly on the iCloud, and they want you to buy more because it's backing up everything, and what's taking up a lot of the storage space that you have probably. Pictures and videos. A lot of people have videos on their phone now. We video, all kinds of stuff to post to our YouTube. And what's the advantage of putting it all on the iCloud? Well, what can you do if your phone gets lost or stolen? You still have access to all of your pictures and your data and all of that. Also, something that's kind of frightening in terms of privacy, and one of the things that we'll talk about when we think about marketing ethics is your privacy and who has it. If you give it to a third party, can they turn it over to the government? If the government wants it, can they find out all kinds of stuff about you? Yeah, well, they can. So I'm not sure that you want to do that. I'm not sure that you want to buy that. So that idea of paying for upgraded amounts of physical or upgraded amounts of storage capacity may be a question mark. The star, and it may have moved from star to cash cow, would be the iPhone, and it may be moving because what's happening with sales of the iPhone? It's going down because people are not willing to buy every 2 years, but they still have older iPhones that they sell in other countries, or you can still buy them if you want the second generation or you want to get a little cheaper. And so that may be a cash cow, or it may be a star that's moving into a cash cow. And then where you want to do with these dogs, low growth, low market share, is you want to divest generally, start getting rid of those. So what would be an example in the tech world of something? There are still people that manufacture fax machines. I don't know why anybody would use them, but they do. And those are probably dogs. You're going to start divesting. That's really old technology. Using them very much. So, conducting a SWOT analysis. Two of these are internal strengths and weaknesses. So you look at your organization and you say, what is it that we do well? And I had you do this for yourself on the first day of class. Think about those things that make you unique, that are going to give you a competitive advantage in the market. Businesses need to do the same thing. They need to think about what it is that we do well. So let's think about two examples that you know a lot about. One of them is one of my favorite targets for criticism. Walmart. I absolutely hate Walmart. How many of you love Walmart? Anybody just love Walmart? How many of you go to Walmart? And how many of you hate Walmart? Lots of people hate Walmart. Why do you hate Walmart?
There's only like 2 lanes open when you go to checkout.
There's only 2 checkout. Of course, they've got self-checkout now, but that doesn't work, particularly now that you can buy beer and wine, good beer and wine in Walmart, and you can't go through the self-checkout if you have anything like that, because why? They have to see your ID. That has to be, you have to give them your ID. That has to be shown, and so you can't go through the self-checkout, and they only have 2 lines. I mean, they act like they're surprised that they have customers. They've got 2 lines open, and it's 1,000,000 miles long, and the woman in front of you in line is 96 years old, and she's turning her purse inside out to come up with the exact change. Like there's some sort of exact change prize that she's gonna win at the end of this exercise. And you went in for, a toothbrush and deodorant, and you just want to get out of Walmart as quickly as possible. I have discovered proof that the Yeti do exist. Now, what is a Yeti? And I don't mean the cooler brand. What is a Yeti?
A creature?
It's a what?
Like mythical creature?
It's a mythical creature, which is commonly referred to as what?
The abominable?
The abominable snowman. I have found evidence that they exist, and they're at the Guthrie Walmart in front of me in line, and they insist on bringing all their Yeti children with them. I don't know why you have to bring all your kids, screaming and wailing and in this valley of tears into the Walmart in front of me. And I hate it. I hate Walmart, but I have to go because they're the cheapest place. So what is Walmart's competitive advantage? Everyday low prices. What have they done to do that? If you want to sell to Walmart, you will have an office in Bentonville, Arkansas. And you will go to Bentonville, Arkansas. And they will tell you what they are willing to pay for your product. They've completely flipped the logistics on its head. Historically, the manufacturer set the initial price and drove the price through the marketing channels by setting that initial price. Walmart, because they have such purchasing power, has flipped that on the head, and they will tell you what they will sell for. And there's an article that came out years ago called "The Man Who Said No to Walmart." And it was about the CEO of Snapper Mowers. And he decided that Walmart wants to sell mowers for, what would you guess their price point is for a lawnmower? At that time, it's been a few years. It's gone up a little bit because of inflation. But about 10 years ago, what would you suggest the price would be for a Walmart mower? What did they want to sell their lawnmowers for?
$50.
It's more than that. A what?
100?
Yeah, they wanted to sell it right at $100. That's what, and then Snapper said, we can't do that. And we don't want to do it because it's going to dilute our brand if we make an inferior product and sell it to you. And so Snapper said, no, they've come back, by the way. And Snapper now sells to Walmart. I don't know how they've done it, but they've now decided. But they wrote this article called "The Man Who Said No to Walmart." It's hard to say no to Walmart because they are the largest retailer of so much stuff. Now that's changing, by the way, because of Amazon. But Walmart is still the largest seller of a lot of things that you need: soap, laundry detergent, textiles. Walmart is the largest retailer of diamonds in the world. Think about that. Diamonds. It's not something you think about when you think, but they are. And they're losing that to Amazon because of convenience, because people hate Walmart so much, and Amazon can sell. You can find prices pretty cheaply on Amazon. But that's what made Walmart competitive. Now, what's the antithesis of Walmart, and what's the competitive advantage for their biggest competitor in the bricks sector? Well, it's Target. What's Target's competitive advantage? Higher quality and a better shopping experience. The price point filters out the Yeti at Target. Their stores are a little bit nicer. Walmart is just piles of stuff laid out. I mean, it's awful. It's a horrible experience. Target's nicer. You can actually find somebody to help you in Target. So what's their competitive advantage? What's their strength? Well, their strength is that we've got a little bit better quality, it's a better shopping experience, and people are willing to pay a little bit more for that. What's Walmart's weakness, would you think?
When it comes to food and stuff.
Okay. They have quite a few, but they were slow, for example, to get into the idea of organic because that's expensive. So maybe they don't have as much selection as you'd want in terms of a variety of food products that may be healthier for you, although they've started to get into that. What else is Walmart's weakness now?
Customer service.
Customer service. I think that's a big one. They do not give good customer service. And as a result, Amazon's able to take over because it's a better experience. It comes to your door. They've got 2-day. It doesn't take very long. It used to be that shipping took a long time. Not anymore. And if you've got Prime, it's a lot better customer experience. So that's some of their weaknesses. They also have, because they are so heavily invested now, they have started to get into the online market, but they were heavily invested in bricks and not clicks. And that takes a while to learn that. And Amazon learned that logistics. Now, I'm not saying that Walmart won't be able to catch up, but that's certainly a weakness. What's Target's weaknesses? Price, one. They also have not been as heavily invested in clicks, and so they're having to compete against Amazon. So things like that. External to the company, opportunities. Where is their growth opportunity? Well, in the online environment, there's huge growth potential, right? What are some of the threats? These are external. So there's opportunities there for growth in terms of online, building an online presence, developing that for Walmart and for Target both. Amazon is realizing that there's opportunities to actually go into going from a clicks to a brick. They've actually got some physical locations now, and you can go in and there's no register. It's just all automatic, and it debits what you get. So they're recognizing there's an opportunity. What are some of the threats that companies face? Some other threats, just in general. What happened with the government shutdown? How much did the economy lose?
15 million a day.
It's more than that. It's a certain percentage of GDP that we lost for every day, they estimate. And the estimates, by the way, are being revised upward in terms of what the economy lost for every day of the shutdown. That's a threat. If government workers don't have paychecks, they're not going out and buying at Walmart or Amazon or any place else. The economy's shrinking. What else could be a threat? Well, the economy could go into a recession. We've been chugging along pretty well. Unemployment's at a all-time low, but we could have an economic recession at any moment. There's a lot of political instability in the world today with Brexit, and nobody's quite certain how that's going to turn out. And the United Kingdom is the largest trading partner in that bloc, and that could have severe economic consequences for the global economy. The United States could go into a recession as a result of various factors. And so those are threats that you have to think about in doing this SWOT analysis. And then, of course, there are threats to individual industries. So there's these macroeconomic threats, but there are also specific threats. So if we think about another industry, one that's near and dear to the hearts of most Oklahomans, because we have a huge sector of our economy that's dependent upon it, oil. What's happening in the oil and the energy industry, broadly speaking, right now? That's a big threat to oil.
Gas prices are low.
Gas prices are really low as a result of the fact that oil is set by the last barrel that's needed on the market, And we're using less and less of it. The United States is actually becoming more and more energy independent. And what are some of the reasons for that? Well, more fuel efficient cars are one reason for that. What's another reason for
Push towards renewable
it?
energy.
The push towards renewable energy. You know, more and more people are choosing hybrid cars. There was a tax incentive to choose an electric car or a hybrid car. And so that's a threat. So what is oil and gas having to do? And what is ExxonMobil talking about with regard to they're now viewing themselves. This is an example of looking out and not being myopic. We talked about Theodore Levitt's seminal article on marketing myopia in a class period. I think during the second week, we discussed this idea of at the turn of the 20th century, a lot of the largest companies in the United States were railroad companies. That's not necessarily true today. Why is that? Because railroad companies thought of themselves as railroad companies when they should have thought of themselves as transportation companies. And ExxonMobil is actually recognizing the fact that you're going to have to look at biofuels and these other alternative forms of energy if you want to stay competitive, because oil may not maintain the dominance that it's had in the energy sector for a foreseeable future. Any questions about strategy before we move into environmental scanning? All right. It's all clear as day, right? So environmental scanning. Changes in the marketing environment are sources of opportunities and threats. We just talked about in the SWOT analysis. So we want to continually acquire information on events that are occurring outside the organization to identify trends. What are some changing trends that you think are up and coming in the environment?
Renewable energy.
Renewable energy. If you went back in time, even 10 years ago, and you drove down I-35, you wouldn't see these big wind turbines that are out there now. Now you go into the Arbuckle Wilderness, and up on those hills, they've got all these wind turbines. You go out on I-40 towards Amarillo, and there's a whole lot of wind turbines. Why is that? Well, in Oklahoma, we have a lot of what? We have a lot of wind. In fact, the song, Oklahoma's official state song, talks about the what? The wind comes sweeping down the plains. We got a lot of wind. Why is it that we have a lot of wind? Where is Oklahoma located? It's right smack dab in the middle of the country. And so we experience frontal passage in Oklahoma on average every 3 days. In the wintertime, and the reason I'm wearing a sweater today rather than a tie and a shirt is because when I got up, my office hours start at 6, and I have office hours after this class for about an hour. But my office hours are from 6 because I'm up at 5 every morning. So I get here early. And what was the temperature this morning when I went out to start my car? It was 21 degrees. It was freezing. Thought I was going to die. I guess I should be grateful that I'm not in Chicago, where the temperature is something like 20 below. And it's going to get worse tonight and tomorrow. So we experience frontal passage on average every 3 days. In terms of other trends, what are we seeing that your generation are interested in? Technology. It's amazing to me how many of my colleagues' children don't care about driving. This has become a big thing that I've noticed with a lot of young adults. First of all, parents aren't encouraging their kids to drive as much as they were when I was growing up. Insurance was still, it was expensive, but it was relatively cheap compared to having an under 25-year-old driver in your household today. And because of technology, They know. It used to be that you just didn't put your kids on your car. But they now know. If you have a licensed driver in the house, they know. And guess what happens to your insurance rates? They go up. And your generation just isn't, for my generation, driving was freedom. I mean, we wanted to get our driver's license. That was a big deal. You started driver's ed, when you were 15 and a half, you got your learner's permit, and then at 16, you got your driver's license and you went out. Your generation doesn't seem to be all that concerned with driving. Why is that? How many of you got your driver's license right at 16? Okay, the majority of you. But how many of you had a car at 16? Okay, quite a few of you. A lot of it's just incredible to me that they're not getting cars. And they're not all that interested in driving. Why is that you're not all that interested in driving? Why would you need to drive? You've got everything you need in the palm of your hand, in the form of this device. You can communicate with your friends. You can, play games on it. Why bother? And one of the things that we know about your generation from studies is that you actually like your parents. We wanted to get away from our parents. You all actually are friends with your parents. More so than my generation was. So that's a trend. So technology, these things are becoming, more and more prevalent. Everybody now has one of these. If you went back in time again 20 years ago, not everybody had a smartphone. Very few people had them. Now almost everybody in the United States has them. You're seeing that, and that's impacting our lives. What does it mean? It means that we can buy stuff a lot easier. How many of you buy stuff off of your phone? Shop on phone? Yeah, that's mobile technology. Going not just online, but to a mobile site that's easy to navigate. So what are the environmental forces that impact these things? There are 5: social, economic, technological, competitive, and regulatory. And each of these are important. So social, what are some of the things that impact social forces? Well, demographics. The world's population today is approximately 7 billion and it's growing. That may be a little old. It may be 7.2 or something like that at this point. There are well over 350 million people in the United States. The population in other places is exploding, but what's happening to the population in developing nations? That's a big social trend change. Well, the US is becoming older. And why is that? And this is a huge threat that we're going to have to deal with. As more and more people retire, is Social Security going to be there? What are you going to do for retirement? One of the reasons that I had growing up, I had 2 examples from which to choose in my life. 2 diametrically opposed examples about retirement. My father is an FBI agent. He was a special agent in charge of a field office for the FBI. At that time, the FBI's mandatory retirement age was 55. My father retired at 55. He's still alive today. He's been retired. He's 82. He's been retired all that time, and he's drawn 75% of his salary from the Bureau, and it goes up because they get cost of living adjustments every year for the rest of his life. My mother, on the other hand, was a serial entrepreneur, and she started business after business after business, and she's still working. My dad retired at 55. My mother's still working. And I decided I wanted to be able to retire at some point. So why is it that I'm here? Well, as a college professor, I have something that most of you will never have. It's called a defined benefit plan when I retire. What does that mean? That means you can figure out what the state of Oklahoma will pay me, and I will retire at 55. And I will get a set amount for the rest of my life. Pretty good deal. Most of you will not go to work for a company that has a defined benefit plan. That used to be the standard. Companies offered pensions. GM, Ford, Chrysler, all offered pensions. American Airlines, they no longer do that. What's happening to you in terms of what you're going to have to do in order to retire? What are you going to have to do? You're going to have to what? Yeah, you're going to have, you're going to have to start investing. The earlier, the better. Let's hope it turns out well for you. Because there aren't a whole lot of pensions. You can't even go to work. One of the things that they used to say is you could go to work for the feds. The feds have a horrible retirement plan. They give you 1% per year in terms of their defined benefit. The rest of it is all a 403B, which is the equivalent of a 401k for the public sector. 1% per year. You'd have to work for 40 years to get what I'll get in 20. So the feds are not even a good retirement plan. States are about the best. You go to work for a state agency. Although in Oklahoma, our last governor screwed up the Oklahoma public employees retirement plan, and she made that into a defined contribution plan, which means it's a 403B. They tried to do that with teachers' retirement. So we have all of these different retirement systems in Oklahoma. There's not just one, we have teachers' retirement. And she tried to do that with teachers' retirement. She tried to turn it from a defined benefit into a defined contribution plan, and she couldn't get it done. Why is that? Because teachers vote. And everybody loves they have a fond memory of their elementary teacher at some point in time. And she couldn't get it done, but she did get it done for the public employees. So if you start in OPERS now, you don't have the same thing. That's a change in the environment. We're getting older. You're going to have to plan for that retirement. We're becoming more diverse in this country. Texas, which was ruby red forever, is changing into Beto O'Rourke almost beat Rafael Eduardo Cruz. I know he doesn't like to use his full name because it sounds he wants to be as anglicized as possible. But Beto O'Rourke almost beat Ted Cruz in Texas. Why is that? Texas becomes minority majority, meaning that the combined populations of Hispanics, African Americans, Asian Americans, and others will be larger than the Anglo population by 2024 or something like that. That's changing. So the diversity in our nation is becoming more and more, increasingly more and more diverse. We now have 5 generations of people working in the workforce. This has never happened before in history. So we have, what are the 5 generations that we have in the workforce? And what does this mean in terms of challenges for businesses? Well, we have traditionalists. For many of you, this will be your grandparents, although it may be your grandparents are actually baby boomers because, people had children fairly young in this part of the country. And so some of your grandparents may be baby boomers. But for a lot of you, your grandparents will be traditionalists. These are people that are older. They may not have planned for retirement, or the pension plans that they had went broke and they've had to be subsidized by the federal government, in which case their benefits have been reduced, and so they're having to work longer. And they're in the workforce. What are traditionalist attitudes, and why is that important? Well, when I left UCO for a brief period of time to go become an executive vice president for a publicly traded company, I worked for a guy who was a traditionalist. He believed that you worked 40 hours or more for 40 hours of pay. He was one of those that firmly believed he was, if you were a salaried employee, which I was, you should give more than 40 hours a week. And you should be in the office. He would come down to my office because I was the executive vice president for administration. And I was also the chief general counsel for the company. And he would complain about the sales VPs. They're never here. They're never in the office. Well, when he started out in business, if you were a salesperson, you were spending probably a fair amount of time in the office because that's where the phone was that you had to answer in order to get business. So you spent a fair amount of time in the office answering the phone. That's not the way salespeople work. And one of the reasons that a lot of people like to go into sales, aside from the fact that you can sort of set your own salary depending on how hard you want to work, but one of the reasons that a lot of our people that we convince to go into sales is because they don't. Your generation doesn't want to be strapped to a desk for 40 hours. And sales is the one profession that you can have where you're not strapped to a desk pretty much. You're going to be out traveling in many sales jobs. But he was convinced like those Kevin is never here. Yeah, well, if Kevin's here, we've got a problem because it means Kevin's not selling. And he just never could get that through his head. But that's the traditionalist mentality. Work hard. That's not what you want to do. You have the children of the traditionalists, which are the baby boomers. That's my mother. For some of you, that's your parents. Baby boomers were the first generation to want to have more of a work-life balance. Technology increased the ability to have more leisure. But they still share some of those characteristics with the traditionalists. They're not necessarily as tech savvy. After the boomers, you get the Gen Xers. That's my generation. What's indicative of the Gen Xers? I read a book when I first started teaching college. I was 22 years old here at UCO. And one of my colleagues suggested that I should read this book called Generation X Goes to College. And now I want to write a book called Generation X Teaches College on my experiences in teaching college. But what was typical of Gen Xers? Well, Gen Xers, we were very much influenced by the postmodern movement. A questioning of everything. A questioning of authority. A belief that you didn't necessarily have to work 40 hours. Like, if you can work smart, why should I sit here for 40 hours? Then comes your generation, or some of you may be younger than Generation Y or Millennials, or Generation Y, as they're sometimes called. And after that, we get Generation, what they're now sort of referring to as Generation Z, which are people that are entering the workforce that are even younger than your generation. So generational cohorts are roughly about 20 years. So we've got this huge diverse, we've got 5 generations in the workforce. There's been a shift in the population. If you went back toward the Industrial Revolution, there was a huge migration from the South to the industrial North, because that's where the jobs were. As farming and agriculture became less important and manufacturing became more important, there was a huge population shift. So huge populations left the South for a number of reasons, one of which would have been that after the Civil War and after the Civil Rights Movement, African Americans particularly had more opportunities in the North than they did in Southern states. And so there was a huge population shift. Now what's happening? As we moved into a technological, the population is now shifting from those northern states. We're emptying out and going south. Why is that? If you didn't like the temperature this morning when you got up, you sure don't like it in New York City today. I'm willing to guarantee it. In Chicago, it's supposed to be colder than Antarctica. So what's happening? People are moving where? Where it's warmer. If you look at the population shifts, it's just emptying out and moving south, where it's more temperate, where it's more. Why did they move to the industrialized North? Well, there was lots of mining there. raw materials were plentiful. That's not the kind of work that we do. What is the real value in the American economy today? It's not in manufacturing. It's in what? It's in services. It's in information technology. It's in mind stuff. And you can do that. You don't have to be at a factory in Detroit, which is close to the iron and things like that. You now can work remotely. So there's been a shift towards southern and western states. And we've seen shifts in our culture. So what is culture? Culture are the values, ideas, and attitudes that we have. What makes up? So as a nation, we talk about the American culture. What is part of our American? What is it that makes us Americans? What makes us different from other places? What's part of our cultural values in this country?
We're a melting pot.
We're a melting pot. Political scientists generally say that the melting pot idea has not happened. What we are is a salad bowl. If you think of a melting pot, what's a melting pot? Well, you put ingredients into a soup, and it's kind of hard to tell what one part is and another part. I mean, if you're putting in, for example, in a soup, broccoli and cheese, it may be somewhat easy to distinguish, but it kind of the broccoli turns mushy and it kind of blends in, and you get a melding of the flavors. In a salad, you have all of those ingredients in there, like you have lettuce and tomatoes and cucumbers and onions and bell peppers or whatever it is you put in there, but they maintain their distinct characteristics, right? You can tell when you're eating a bite of tomato as opposed to a bite of lettuce. So a lot of political scientists say what we have is a salad bowl, but you're correct. What we have is we have a radically more diverse population than many places in, say, Western Europe, which are still largely homogeneous populations ethnically. So yes, we're much more diverse ethnically. So that's one thing that we are. What else are some American values? I used to teach a course called American National Government. That's why I told you all I started out as a political scientist. So I taught government, and I decided that marketing was better because it paid more, and I didn't have to put up with students that would say things like, I go into my American National Government class and I'd say, why are you here? I just don't like government and politics. It's boring. And I found that fascinating because government is not something that you can stand back from like a Picasso and decide that you don't much care for it. Everything that you do will be touched by government. It is a pervasive institution. Just like marketing is a pervasive social activity, government is a pervasive institution. You are sitting in a what? Today. Where are you sitting? What is this institution? But what is it? It's a government institution. You're sitting here in a government institution. It's a pervasive thing. But students, I just don't like it. It's boring. Right? But it's a pervasive institution. What are some of those values that make our government different than others? Well, I used to have students write this paper called My American Dream in that class. And I would say, if you ask people what their American dream is, what is it? And if you went, and the reason this is important, if you went to other countries, I was a foreign exchange student in high school to Germany, they would never have dreamed of saying something called My German Dream. They wouldn't write a paper, like because of World War II and those experiences, they don't have a burning nationalism in Germany that we do here. They just don't have that. They don't like my German, that's antithetical to sort of their culture as a result of the collectivist guilt that they feel after 2 world wars. But I would have students write this paper called My American Dream. Well, what is the American dream? What is it that makes us Americans? And this is antithetical again to sort of the German experience. Germany is a very small country in Europe, at least geographically. What does that mean? What's part of the American dream? When I say American dream, and it's changing. It used to be that people would say their American dream was what? I want to get married, I want to buy a house, and I want to have kids. That's changing. Now people are saying, I don't necessarily want to get married. Most people still want to buy a house. That's still part of the American dream. That's still part of our culture. Why is that? In Germany, the family that I lived with, they owned their own home. They were solidly middle class, but the kids didn't necessarily think that they were going to buy homes because it's a small country. Land is expensive. And so not everybody owns a home there. Lots of people rent. They live in apartments. The only place that you'd go in the United States where people might not have the dream of home ownership would be where in this country? New York City. Even in Los Angeles, where property values are expensive, people still have this idea. That's why Los Angeles is so spread out. Because people still have this idea that they want to have a home. Even in Chicago. Now, there are lots of people that, but, for the most part of the American dream is, I want to own a home. I have this little plot of dirt. And that's very different from other countries. In the United Kingdom, lots of people don't own homes. In Germany, lots of people don't own homes. They rent. And they live in big cities. So that's part of our culture as values as Americans that we share. Now, within that culture as a whole, we have subcultures, don't we? Are we different in Oklahoma than, say, New York? What are some of the differences between Oklahomans and New Yorkers?
The pace.
The what?
The pace.
The pace? How so?
New York is like a very fast-paced city that stays up all night. Oklahoma is the opposite.
Okay. Yeah, the city never sleeps. You can find something to do at all hours of the day in New York City. Of course, you can still do that in Oklahoma City. You can go to the Walmart with the Yeti here. People just walk faster in New York City. I mean, during the workday, if you're just standing around, I've been a tourist in New York City. My brother used to live there. He works for Goldman Sachs, the evil empire. And he's been transferred to their Dallas office, but he lived in New York for a while. Like the crowds just move. Like at 7 a.m. when people are getting to work, you'll be shoved. If you're just standing there looking around, looking at the tall buildings, you'll be shoved. What else is different between New Yorkers and Oklahomans? New York overwhelmingly elected Hillary Rodham Clinton to represent them in the United States Senate. Would we ever elect Hillary Rodham Clinton to dog catcher in Oklahoma? Politically, they're far more liberal. Oklahoma's far more conservative. What are some other cultural values and differences? The first time I went to visit my brother in New York, we went out for breakfast. What's a staple of Southern breakfast? What'd you guess?
Biscuits and gravy.
Biscuits and gravy. And we went to this place and I was like, where's the biscuits and gravy? And he's like, they don't make that here. I was like, no place makes biscuits. No, they don't. We went I'm thinking in New York, you got to find someplace. So I found this place that said that they had good Southern cooking. They still didn't have biscuits and gravy. You know what their idea of Southern cooking was? They had grits on the menu. No biscuits and gravy. How do you have breakfast without biscuits and gravy? It's antithetical to me that they just don't have it in New York. Just not something that they eat. So we have different cultures and values and attitudes. What would be different between us and, say, California? Again, they're more liberal. What about fashion trends? Fashions have a tendency to start at the coasts and work their way in. So if you go to California, you see people wearing things that you would not see in Oklahoma. We tend to be much more conservative here. You don't see any Lady Gaga showing up to class, but it's not unusual to see people in really wild fashions in places like California and New York. Economic. So macroeconomic conditions, GDP, unemployment, price changes. What's happening? Well, GDP has shrunk as a result of the government shutdown. That's a macroeconomic force. Unemployment is at an all-time low. What does that mean for business? Well, it means that people have more money to spend, but it also means, and most times, this has been one of the unusual things. Donald Trump has been able to say unemployment is the lowest during my presidency, but one of the things that has not happened during this economic boom and this unemployment, low unemployment time is that historically, when you have low unemployment, what happens for businesses? Well, wages go up because there's more demand and more pressure to pay people better wages because people know that they can get another job. That's not happening. For the first time in history, where we have really low unemployment, the average American salary is not rising to keep up with that economic factor. But unemployment is one of those things. If we have high unemployment, what does it mean? It means that businesses have their they have a selection of workers and at lower costs usually. If you're following the stock market, you have a recession, you have high unemployment. There are stocks that do well during that period of time. What would be one stock that would do well during high unemployment and recession? Historically, liquor. People self-medicate. With rapidly increasing legalization of marijuana, Oklahoma now has the most liberal medical marijuana laws on the books. You think that that's going to, if we have high unemployment, you think marijuana stocks are going to go through the roof? If we have a recession and an economic downturn, everybody going to be running out and getting that medical marijuana card? Maybe. Microeconomic trends, consumer income, disposable income, discretionary income, you should know what those are. The difference between them, between gross, disposable, and discretionary. What else are microeconomic trends? Those are things within specific industries. So what's happening, what's one of the things that can happen, for example, in the oil sector? Well, oil prices, as I suggested, are set by the last barrel of oil that's needed. If you have one barrel too few, oil prices spike. If you have one barrel too many, oil prices drop. So what can happen in the economic sector? The longest running, but not the most successful cartel in the world is OPEC. Actually, I'm not sure that it's the longest running. That may not be true. De Beers may be a longer running cartel. It's certainly more successful. But OPEC is one of the oldest cartels. They attempt to influence the prices of oil by setting quotas for the member nations that are part of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Interestingly enough, most people think that OPEC was founded by the Middle East, by some Middle East country. If I ask you who founded OPEC, a lot of people would say Saudi Arabia because they're one of the big players in OPEC. But who actually founded OPEC? Anybody know? Venezuela. Venezuela is a huge exporter of oil. But their oil is what? What is it that we produce a lot of in Oklahoma? There's two types of oil when we get it out of the ground. And we produce one type, and Venezuela produces another type. What do we produce in Oklahoma? God, you all, it's Oklahomans, you should know this. Light sweet crude. And what makes it light as opposed to heavy? Light sweet crude is easier to refine. Venezuela produces heavy crude. And so they are one of the founding members of OPEC. They've attempted to control prices through setting quotas. Now, sometimes they've been better at doing that than other times, but it's very difficult to do, particularly when things like Russia has increased its oil supply. The United States has increased its oil supply. We found more oil in the United States. We're able to refine it in increasingly more and more sophisticated ways, and so we can do things like tar sands. And so that's one of those things that's a microeconomic trend within the specific industry. Technology, innovations, and inventions. This has radically changed the business landscape. How so? Even in terms of, even if you watch television and you don't DVR stuff and you have to watch the commercials because you want to watch things, and what's the biggest period of time in which people actually still will watch something and watch the commercials? Yeah, the Super Bowl is definitely one, and almost any sporting event, because once the sporting event is over and you know what the score is, do you want to watch it anymore? No. Anybody want to watch football? So people still actually will sit through commercials during sporting events because they want, there's the excitement of seeing whether or not your team wins or loses. But in the past, you didn't have a lot to do, and so you'd sit there, you might get up, you go to the restroom, you get another Diet Coke or beer or get some chips, whatever during the commercial, but you still had a lot of attention. Now, the minute the commercial comes on, what happens to people? You reach for your phone. So this has influenced not only the way we buy stuff, but it's also influenced the way, we're no longer watching commercials so we're having to come up with ways as marketers to get you to watch commercials. What are some of the ways that we're doing? Well, we're now putting commercials on these devices. You go on YouTube, you want to watch a YouTube video. If that provider, I have not done this on my YouTube channel, because I don't think I've got enough views to make it worth it. Because usually students that have taken my class that have missed, or they want to review something for the test that watch the videos. But lots of people are putting this out there. They're monetizing their video, which means they're becoming a YouTube partner. And now you're forced to watch, if you want to watch that video, at least part of a commercial before you can go flipping through it. And some of them insist that you watch the entire commercial of 5 seconds. And now you're sort of trapped. So we're having to come up with ways to watch it. So this device has had radical transformation on the way we buy things, the way we experience things, like watching television. It used to be, when I was growing up, if you got bored or you didn't want to watch the commercial, what would you have to do? Well, it wasn't real easy to do something else. You'd pick up a book or a magazine and start flipping through it. But that takes a lot of attention. This device, you can check your Paradise Bay or play Angry Birds during the commercials. It doesn't take a whole lot of attention. It's easy to do. And so you can shift your focus. So we're radically transforming. This is radically transformed. What else does this do for us in terms of how else has this changed things?
We can order food on there and give it.
Order food. How about the way you drive? I mean, it used to be you pull out a map and look, Now you hit the, MapQuest and you got directions, the shortest route. And it will even start doing things like what? If you use any of the different, there's lots of different map things that you can use. You can use the one that Apple has on here. You can use Google Maps. You can use Waze. How many of you have used Waze? It's a good app. What will these apps tell you? They'll tell you where the cops are. They'll also tell you, I don't see anybody getting stopped very much anymore. That used to be a thing. They would stop you for speeding. They're far more interested in interdicting drugs now than they are in looking at speeders for some reason. They get more bang for the buck out of catching drug dealers because they then get to impound the cars and take them. If you're in a car and there's drugs in the car, they'll find a way of saying that you're a dealer, and there goes your car. Bye-bye. Much more bang for the buck. And then they sell it at an auction, at a police auction. But so Waze will tell you where the police are. What else will it do? Well, it will tell you, like rerouting, if you want to avoid traffic, it will say, you know, we've got a route that will save you 5 minutes. Exit now. Because it starts looking at where there are traffic jams. And it's based on this GPS location and knowing all of that. So this is radically transformed even the way we drive. It can be difficult to predict which of these will rise and which will fall. It was estimated at the time that Facebook, when I used to start teaching, when I first started having to teach about social media and marketing, that Facebook at the time that it came out, they said these social media platforms would last about 2 years. Well, Facebook has obviously lasted a lot longer than that. Before Facebook, there was something called, and you all probably don't even remember this, MySpace. How many of you remember MySpace? A few of you remember MySpace. And why did MySpace fail and Facebook? I was kind of fascinated by this because I predicted this incorrectly. I thought that MySpace would be much more dominant than Facebook would over the long haul. And why is it that MySpace really failed? What was it that made MySpace interesting? Well, before MySpace, if you wanted to have a website, you had to either hire somebody or you had to know something about computer programming to develop that website. You had to, and MySpace allowed you to go out and capture code and plug it in and customize your experience. Now, what that did was, and I thought that's great because individuals like to differentiate themselves. They like to customize. I thought, and Facebook was very clean. Facebook didn't allow you to do that. But what happened with MySpace was people started capturing so much code and they started putting so much out there, you know, banners and flashing this and all of the different backgrounds, that it became difficult to load pages. And they became clunky. And Facebook was more streamlined and sleek. I don't even think MySpace is around. Lots of technologies have come about that have died. The biggest social media stars, and they now have categories for these in the award shows for best social media video, started on a platform called Vine, and Vine is gone. And so Logan Paul and his brother, who are YouTube sensations now, started out on Vine. So these platforms can be very difficult to predict which ones will rise and which ones will fall as technology changes so quickly. The competitive market that you're in terms of the business, the forms of competition. In pure competition, you have lots of sellers and the prices are set very competitively. You've got 4 gas stations on 4 different corners, and you'll see this in lots of cities in America. And you think, how can they have 4 gas stations? They all survive. And what happens with gas prices? They're all set about what? The same. Because people have absolutely no brand loyalty for the most part, do they? You're just looking for what? The cheapest gas. That's all you care about. So it's highly competitive. When my brother was going to school at OSU, there were 2 guys that owned all of the gas stations in Stillwater. And gas prices in Stillwater were about 20 to 30% higher than they were in the rest of the state. And why was that? Because they could get away with it because they met once a week for lunch and they engaged in something that's illegal, but it's very difficult to prove, called price fixing. But that's the unusual, that, you know, in Oklahoma City, there's lots of, you've got Valero, you've got what? On Q. We don't have a Quick Trip here. You've got 7-Eleven, Love's, all of these different places. And so you've got this pure competition. In monopolistic competition, you have many sellers with substitutable products within a price range. So if you've got lots of substitutes, what's a substitute for Diet Coke? Well, Diet Pepsi or any other diet soft drink. Coffee versus tea. Similar products. And in oligopoly, you have very few competitors, and they all generally know where they are in the market. Airlines. So airlines generally don't engage in competition directly. They know which routes they fly the most efficiently, and they have a tendency to do that and stick to those routes. And they know what all the others are doing, and they start price wars, but it's generally not beneficial to any of them to do it, so they try to avoid it. Southwest started out as what? Primarily being in the Southwest. They figured that was the most efficient and most profitable routes for them to fly, and so they flew. They actually started out as a totally intra-state airline in the state of Texas. They flew between Dallas, Austin, and Houston for oil businessmen that had to get between those three routes. And then they expanded over time, but there are very few. Their prices are highly competitive. They know where they're at, but you don't have a lot of choices. And then you can have a pure monopoly, utilities. Why is it that if you live in Edmond, they don't do a whole lot of Edmond Electric, which is owned by the city. The city owns the franchise for the electric company here. Doesn't do a whole lot of advertising. Well, they don't have to. If you have a house in Edmond, can you just decide that you're gonna I think I want to buy from OG&E? No, you can't do that. You have to buy from Edmond Electric. You have to get your water if you live in Edmond from who? Can you decide you can dig a well, in theory. Can you do that? We're on the Garber-Wellington Aquifer right here, but Edmond won't let you do that. If you build a house in Edmond, can you just dig a well? Nope. You have to be hooked up to Edmond water. So do they need to advertise? No, they don't. Cable. Cable companies are licensed in a certain area. There's no competition. Now there's some competition. You could have Dish, but is that really competitive with cable? What about AT&T Uverse? Is that really competitive? I don't know. So you have monopolies. These are generally small. We have in the United States something called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which prevents monopolies on a large scale. But in local areas like utilities, you can have monopolies. They're highly regulated, and you can have that. But in theory, if you had a completely capitalistic system, you would have a lot of monopolies that would form if you didn't have antitrust regulations, because it would tend to consolidate. You'd have the consolidation of companies. The regulatory system. So in the United States, one of the things that makes us interesting and difficult for businesses to navigate is that we have a federal system of government in which each unit is sovereign. So we have the national and we have the state governments. And this means that you oftentimes have duplicative regulations at both the federal and the state level. Where they overlap in the sovereignty, these are called concurrent powers. So what are some examples of this? What makes our system unique is that unlike a unitary system, like say Great Britain or France, the federal government cannot overstep its bounds and interfere into what are traditionally state rights issues, and they cannot destroy the states. In a unitary system like they have in France, all power is derived from the central government and is pushed down to those lower levels, and that which the central government creates, it can take back. That doesn't happen in the United States. Each of these parts is sovereign over their sphere. So the federal government cannot destroy the state of Oklahoma, and likewise the state of Oklahoma can't destroy the federal government, but the federal government can't interfere, and so we have the federal government and the states both regulating business. Now, for most of our history, we had what was called the layer cake model of federalism, where you had the national government on top, or the federal government, and the state government on bottom. And most of the governing actually occurred in this area where they overlapped was their concurrent powers. Most of the governing was done at the state level. Three things led to what became known as the marble cake model of federalism, where you can't determine if you have a marble cake, say chocolate and vanilla, you get these swirls and you can't determine where one part of the cake begins and the other one ends. And three things led to this marble cake model. The Industrial Revolution, people started moving from the south to the north into industrialized cities. And as we got more and more people living closer and closer together, that creates more problems, and it put pressure on the government to respond to those problems in ways that they hadn't before in technology. So, for example, when Ford Motor Company developed the first really marketable car on a mass-produced scale, there wasn't a need for a federal highway system to breach, people still didn't do that. They traveled by railroad. There was one car company. As more and more you started seeing more and more interstate commerce being derived as a result of people who could move more easily. And so you started having more and more pressure put on the national government to start doing things and regulating in those areas. As more and more food began to be processed across state lines, one state could no longer just deal with the problems that were happening as a result of the fact that we had bad food that was being sold. It was not just one state's problem. It moved into interstate commerce. And so the Industrial Revolution led to that. The second thing that led to it was the Great Depression. In 1929, we had the stock market collapse. We also saw the collapsing of farm prices and a mass migration of people out of places like during the Dust Bowl. That was an environmental hazard that also occurred at the same time. We saw people moving out of Oklahoma and foreclosures occurring by banks of vast swaths of people's properties. And this created a lot of pressure on the government, again, to do something, to come up with a solution to the Great Depression. And we get FDR's Works Projects Administration as an attempt to try and deal with that, to try and solve and spend our way out of those crises. And then the third thing was the Civil Rights Movement. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court decided in a case called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that we were not going to have separate but equal, that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. 1963. I think it's 1964. It took 10 years for Congress then to go ahead and say we're not going to allow discrimination to occur in other places. So Brown starts it, but it only applies to areas of public accommodation like schools. It didn't apply to all of the other areas of life like hotels and restaurants and places like that. And we get two sets of decisions as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In 1964, right after the act is passed, two companies challenge the act as violative of this idea of interstate commerce and Congress's ability to regulate. One was called the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. And these are potential test questions. They're not in the book. And Katzenbach versus McClung. Sister cases that came up to the United States Supreme Court. The Heart of Atlanta in the South, after a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, all sorts of facilities were segregated. The United States Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson says that it does not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution to have separate but equal facilities. After the Civil War, we got 3 amendments to the United States Constitution. The 13th frees the slaves. It makes the Emancipation Proclamation the law of the land. It enshrines that in the Constitution. We get the 14th, which contains one of 2 due process clauses in the United States Constitution and the only Equal Protection Clause. And then we get the 15th, which gives the free men who were previously enslaved the right to vote. Then we get Plessy versus Ferguson, and the Supreme Court says it doesn't violate equal protection if you have separate but equal facilities for these groups. And so all sorts of things in Southern life were segregated. Hotels, restaurants, everything like that. The Heart of Atlanta Motel was not a chain motel. They operated solely within the state of Georgia. And they argued that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 violated Congress's ability. The thing that Congress did is they did all of these findings and they said, we're going to regulate this area based on something called the Interstate Commerce Clause. In Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, you get this Interstate Commerce Clause. Article 1, Section 8, Interstate Commerce. The Interstate Commerce Clause says that the federal government has the power to regulate commerce among the states, between Indian nations, and foreign governments. Everything that the Constitution doesn't specify, according to the Bill of Rights, as being a power of the federal government is either reserved to the states or the people. That means that intra-state commerce, I-N-T-R-A, intra as opposed to inter-state commerce, is left to the states to regulate. Intra-state commerce is left to the states to regulate. Heart of Atlanta said, we are wholly within the state of Georgia. We're not a chain. We don't cater to, we don't cater to a chain style. We don't have, all these different things that a chain would have. We're wholly involved in intra-state commerce. And the Supreme Court said, no, you're not. You're involved in interstate commerce because when people travel, they have to have a place to stay. There's a movie that's come out called The Green Book. Some of you might have seen it, that deals with traveling. In the South, African Americans couldn't stay in hotels in many places. There were no hotels. So you had to know where to go. And the Supreme Court looks at this and says, of course you're involved in interstate commerce. This is affecting their ability to travel. That is interstate. You're not just catering to people from Georgia. Ollie's Barbecue was located off the beaten path. It was wholly within the confines of a state. And they said, we don't cater to tourists. We're not listed on a billboard. We're wholly involved in intrastate commerce. And the United States Supreme Court said, no, you're not. Where did your ketchup packets come from? Ollie's Barbecue was in the South. Who is the biggest manufacturer of ketchup? Who manufactures most ketchup? Heinz. Where's Heinz manufactured? Wasn't in the South. They're a Northeastern company. So they said, you got your ketchup packets, you got your meat, you got your silverware. So you're involved in interstate commerce. So this allowed the federal government to really regulate in areas that heretofore had been. And so we get this marble cake model as a result of the Great Depression, technology, and the civil rights movement that have led to huge increases. What does this mean for businesses? It means that we have duplicative regulations that a lot of countries don't have. In unitary systems, France decides at the national level what they're going to regulate, and they do it exclusively. In the United States, let's suppose you want to have a restaurant. You're going to have to deal with both regulations that involve USDA in terms of the food quality that you can serve, but you're also going to have what? Local health inspectors who will come out and license you and tell you what, you can't just go out and slaughter the cow in the backyard and decide that you're going to have, your own farm to market restaurant there. Can't do it. The USDA will come in and shut you down. And then you're going to have to deal with local regulators as well in terms of the health department coming out and inspecting all kinds of things. So you've got dual regulation in many instances. A lot of these led to the integration of all of these forces, and these three things you see an integration of all of these. The Great Depression led to technology advances in terms of farming. So it impacted the technological force. It impacted the social force because we saw a lot of people leave places like the South. People left Oklahoma in huge numbers, and they went to California. These were called Okies. That was a pejorative term that the Californians gave to these people that were migrating out of Oklahoma and the Dust Bowl. It led to economic regulation on the part of the federal government to try and stabilize the market. The civil rights movement has led to social forces and technological changes and environmental impacts. And then, of course, technology, this has led to huge changes in all kinds of things. One of the things that we have a problem with, thinking about the environment, for example, with regard to this is, once you're done with this, what should we do with it? Can you just, it's got stuff in it that can be toxic and hazardous. You shouldn't just toss it into the landfill, right? So all of these things sort of are examples of how the integration of these forces affect the economic, the regulatory, the social, the political, all of that together. And I am out of time. And I finished environmental scanning, so we'll talk about ethics. We're right on schedule next time. I did pass the roll sheet, didn't I? All right, so if you didn't sign the roll sheet, make sure that you sign it. Okay. You need to, next time you need to remind me so that we get you into the It's actually
Well, I had out all day like I have What's that? So what is that file code?
So you go to the and then it's called.
Anybody else need to sign this?
You wanna sign this?
I'll sign up, but.
So handsome.
Yeah, but I'm not.
Oh, right.